The room was dimly lit by the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the half-drawn blinds. The harsh sound of a door slamming echoed from the hallway, making Sarah's heart race. She turned, almost too slowly, to face the empty space in the corner. The dog's memorial, once carefully placed on the small wooden shelf, was gone. Her hands trembled as she scanned the room, hoping for a trace of what once was. The collar, the paw print, the small framed photo of Max, all of it vanished. Her breath caught in her throat as she pieced together what had just happened. "No," she whispered, barely able to believe it. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to understand how it could have happened. How could her roommate, someone she trusted, do something so heartless? The betrayal stung deep, like a wound that wouldn't heal. In the silence that followed, she fought the tears threatening to break free. Every object in the room now felt like a cruel reminder of the emptiness that had just been torn away. The absence of the memorial felt like a physical weight on her chest. It wasn't just the loss of an item. It was the loss of a memory, a bond that had kept her grounded for years. She clenched her fists, her mind racing for an answer, any answer. Sarah stood there, her mind racing in a whirlwind of emotions. How could this happen? She closed her eyes, trying to control the chaos inside her. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family, her only companion through the darkest days of her life. The memorial had been a small act of love, a way to keep his memory alive, but now it was gone. She moved to the couch, her hands still shaking, and sat down. A tear escaped, but she wiped it quickly, angry at herself for feeling so vulnerable. She had spent years building this home, and now it felt like it was being taken from her, piece by piece. The silence in the room was deafening. There was no one else to talk to, no one who would understand the pain. She had always kept to herself, trusting only Max. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, an incoming message from her roommate. Sarah's stomach twisted in anticipation. "Can we talk?" it read. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. What could she possibly say to her now? Sarah stared at the phone for what felt like hours, her finger hovering over the screen. The words "can we talk?" echoed in her mind. What was there to say? She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to forgive. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to ignore it. Reluctantly, she typed a response, her fingers moving quickly, but without certainty. "Fine. We can talk," she hit send, almost instantly regretting it. Her mind raced as she awaited the inevitable confrontation. What excuse could her roommate possibly have? There was no justification for this. The room felt like a prison, the walls closing in around her. She couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. Her stomach churned, and for the first time in years, she felt completely alone. She heard the door creak open, and she froze. The door creaked open, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't even have to look up, she knew who it was. Emma, her roommate, stepped into the room, her expression unreadable. Sarah remained seated, her fists clenched tightly on her lap. There was no anger in Emma's eyes, just a cold indifference that made Sarah's blood boil. Emma's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but she hesitated. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I didn't think it would matter that much," she said, her voice calm, almost dismissive. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. "It did matter," Sarah replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "It wasn't just a stupid item. It was my dog's memory. It was all I had left." Emma's gaze dropped, as if she couldn't bear to meet Sarah's eyes. "I didn't think you'd notice." The words felt like a slap, sharp and cold. Sarah stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't get to decide what matters to me," she said, her voice rising with emotion. Emma recoiled slightly, but Sarah couldn't stop herself. The betrayal ran deeper than she could explain. Sarah's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. She was trembling, but she refused to back down. Emma stood up slowly, her gaze finally meeting Sarah's. The silence that followed was suffocating, and Sarah could feel her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm sorry," Emma muttered, but it was hollow, barely a whisper. "Sorry?" Sarah repeated, her voice dangerously calm now. Sorry for what exactly? For throwing away a piece of my life? For erasing a memory I can never get back? Emma's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. But Sarah didn't feel any relief. She was still furious, still hurt. I'll buy you a new one, Emma said weakly, as if that could somehow fix what she had done. You can't replace what's gone, Sarah replied sharply, her eyes narrowing. The memorial was just a symbol, but that symbol was everything to me. You've ruined something I can never get back. Emma took a hesitant step towards Sarah, but the space between them felt vast, as though the betrayal had built an insurmountable wall. Sarah shook her head, turning away. I need time. I need space. She began walking toward her room, her voice breaking slightly. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. The door slammed behind her, the sound final. Sarah sat on the couch, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. She couldn't understand why Emma had thrown away the memorial, why her roommate couldn't see how much it meant to her. The silence between them felt unbearable now. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her trance. It was another message from Emma. I really am sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Sarah's jaw clenched. She didn't want to forgive, didn't want to let Emma off the hook so easily. But the message lingered in her mind, gnawing at her. She couldn't ignore it, couldn't forget that it was Emma who had lived with her, laughed with her, shared countless memories. And yet, Emma had shown such cold disregard for something that had been a piece of Sarah's heart. The betrayal was deeper than she could explain, and her trust was shattered. Yet, despite the anger bubbling inside her, part of Sarah wanted to believe the apology. What does it even mean to forgive, she thought. Was forgiveness about moving on, or about allowing someone to re-enter a space they'd broken? As Sarah sat there contemplating Emma's message, she realized just how deeply the betrayal had cut her. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the wound reopen. She walked to the window and stared out at the fading light, wondering how to move forward. Could she ever trust Emma again? Could she ever be around her without seeing the damage done? The answer was unclear, but she knew one thing for sure. She needed space. Her thoughts turned inward as she considered her next steps. Sarah had always been independent, but this betrayal had taken something from her she couldn't easily recover. The anger she felt wasn't something she could just forget. She thought back to the countless nights spent comforting Max when no one else was around, when he was the only one who listened. The dog's loss was still fresh, but the betrayal was like salt in an open wound. She knew she couldn't live like this, trapped in a home with someone who couldn't understand her pain. The following day, Sarah's mind was still consumed with the idea of leaving. She couldn't keep living in this tension. The room felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in on her. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Emma. This time, it was a plea. Please, Sarah, don't shut me out. We've been through too much for this to end like this. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. How many apologies would it take for this to feel real? She tossed the phone aside, not wanting to read anymore. She was tired of hearing apologies that never seemed to change anything. She stood up and walked to her room, determined to make a decision. The room felt colder now, and she felt a deep emptiness inside her, one that she couldn't ignore. She looked at the few belongings she had left in her space. Her dog's collar, the one that had been so carelessly discarded, still lay on the dresser. It felt like the only piece of comfort she had left, and yet it only reminded her of what she had lost. Sarah made up her mind. She was going to pack up her dog's things and leave. Not just the room, but the situation, the betrayal, everything. She would take control of her life again, reclaim the space that felt so empty now. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. Emma could apologize as much as she wanted, but it didn't change the fact that trust had been broken. She couldn't live under the same roof as someone who didn't respect her boundaries, someone who thought it was okay to throw away a piece of her heart. Sarah pulled out her suitcase and began filling it with her dog's belongings. The blanket, the toys, the collar. She paused, holding the collar in her hands, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She couldn't stay in a place that no longer felt safe. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she ignored it. She didn't need to hear another word from Emma. Once the suitcase was packed, Sarah stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Her hands gripped the handle tightly as she surveyed the room, the place she had once shared with Emma, the place that had once felt like home. It no longer felt that way. Emma's presence was suffocating, her apologies meaningless. Sarah felt the anger and sadness swirl inside her, but it was tempered by a growing sense of resolve. She wasn't going to let Emma define her anymore. The damage had been done, but Sarah was ready to move on. She walked to the door, suitcase in hand, and stopped. With one last glance at the room, she made her decision. It was time to change the locks. She wasn't going to let anyone in until they truly understood what had happened. She stepped out of the room and walked down the hallway, feeling more confident with each step. The door behind her closed, with a finality that felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. Sarah paced around the room, her mind racing with thoughts of the confrontation that was sure to come. Her heart still ached from the betrayal, but a strange calmness had taken over. She had changed the locks, and now, Emma was outside, demanding entry. The thought of facing her again filled Sarah with a mixture of anger and relief. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The last few days had been filled with restlessness, as Sarah wrestled with her emotions. The pressure to forgive, the pressure to move on, it had all weighed heavily on her. She had been pushed to her limit, and now, finally, she felt like she was in control. The sound of knocking at the door broke her thoughts. "Sarah, please." Emma's voice, desperate and weak, came through the crack in the door. "Can we just talk?" Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She didn't want to talk. She didn't owe her an explanation. But as the silence lingered, Sarah realized that this wasn't just about Emma anymore. It was about Sarah taking back what was hers. The knocking continued, each sound like a drum beat echoing through Sarah's chest. She felt her breath quicken, but she refused to let it show. Sarah knew that if she opened that door, it would mean letting Emma back into her life, into her space, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. The anger from the past few days surged again, filling her with a need to stand firm. But there was something in Emma's voice that gnawed at her. Was it genuine regret, or just another attempt to get back into Sarah's good graces? It was hard to say. Sarah's hand hovered over the door handle for a long moment, her thoughts battling each other. She closed her eyes, picturing her dog, Max, and the simple joy of their companionship. That was what mattered most, not Emma's apology, not the past. But was she strong enough to let go of everything else? To face what had been broken and accept that some things couldn't be fixed? Sarah shook her head, walking away from the door. She wasn't ready. After the knocking stopped, an eerie silence settled over the apartment. Sarah sat on the couch, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze lost in thought. Emma's absence was a strange relief, but the emptiness it left behind was just as overwhelming. The decision to lock Emma out wasn't as satisfying as Sarah had imagined it would be. She had expected a sense of triumph, but all she felt now was more isolation. She knew she had done what was necessary, but it didn't come without a price. She had pushed away the one person who had once been a friend, someone who had shared in her most intimate moments. The question lingered in the back of her mind. Was it worth it? Sarah glanced over at the suitcase she had packed, still sitting in the corner of the room. She had moved everything of importance, her dog's things, her memories. But was it enough? Could she really walk away from everything she had built here, or would she regret it the moment she left? The silence stretched on, and the weight of her decision bore down on her. Later that night, Sarah finally gathered the strength to leave. She stood at the door, staring at the lock, as if it were a symbol of everything she had lost, and everything she was determined to protect. She had never been the type to run away from her problems, but this situation was different. She wasn't running, she was reclaiming her power. She glanced back at the apartment, the memories that had once filled it now fading into the shadows. Max's collar still lay on the dresser, untouched. Sarah picked it up, holding it in her hands for a moment, the weight of the small object grounding her. This was all she had left of him, but it was enough. She slipped it into her pocket and stepped out of the door, closing it gently behind her. As the lock clicked into place, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in days, she was in control of her own space, her own life. As Sarah stepped into the hallway, she felt a mix of emotions flood through her: relief, sadness, uncertainty. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let anyone dictate her life again. She had spent too long trying to please others, compromising her own needs, her own happiness. But now, with Mac's memory tucked safely in her pocket, Sarah was ready to start anew. The hallway felt strangely freeing, as if she had stepped into a different world. The apartment door behind her was locked, but the emotional lock on her heart was still a bit looser, a bit more open. As she walked down the hall, she found herself taking deep, steadying breaths. She didn't know where she would go next, but she would face it head on. Sarah stood at the edge of the park, hands buried deep in her pockets. The evening sky, painted in soft oranges and pinks, contrasted with the heaviness she felt. The apartment was behind her, Emma was behind her, but the pain still lingered. The decision was made, but the emptiness followed. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. She wasn't ready to face another message from Emma. Sarah turned her face to the sky. The anger, the hurt, it still hung in the air. But all she could do was move forward. The weight was hers to carry, and yet, she was determined not to look back. Days blurred together. Sarah walked the streets, visited parks, and allowed her thoughts to wander. It wasn't escape, it was about finding clarity. Each step felt like progress, but doubt lingered. Was she wrong to shut Emma out? Had she given up too soon? She fought the urge to reconsider. Sarah wasn't ready to question her decision. She focused on the movement of her feet, the sound of her own steps. For now, that was enough. One evening, Sarah sat in a cafe she'd passed many times. The warmth of her coffee, the soft sound of piano music, and the quiet chatter of people made her realize how much she had been avoiding life. She had been consumed by anger and grief, but now she felt a slight shift. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She could start small, find comfort in the quiet, and breathe again. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in days, she felt at peace. The next morning, Sarah received another text from Emma. "I don't want to lose you." The words hit her hard. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Could she go back? The locks had been changed, the space between them had widened, but Emma's plea made her question it all. After a long pause, Sarah set her phone down. No more looking back. She had made her choice, and it was time to move forward. Sarah stood at the door of her new apartment, a place that felt empty, but also like a fresh start. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, she felt in control. The past was still there, but it wasn't consuming her anymore. She left Emma's message unanswered. The silence in the apartment was peaceful, and Sarah could hear the distant sounds of the city outside. This was her new beginning, and though it was hard, it felt like the right choice. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed in her new apartment, the silence around her heavy. The space felt both peaceful and unsettling. Her phone buzzed, but she didn't pick it up. Emma's absence felt like a relief, but also a deep ache. She had walked away, but the loneliness still crept in. She had told herself she'd heal, but was she strong enough to fully let go of what was once family? The room was empty, but it felt full of questions. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to quiet the noise in her mind. She wasn't going back. Sarah stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city around her buzzed, but it felt distant. She wasn't running away, she was finding herself again. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery made her stomach growl, reminding her of the simple joys she'd forgotten. The world was still turning, even if she was standing still. She smiled to herself, realizing she didn't need to rush her healing. Small moments of peace were enough for now. Sarah's phone buzzed again the next day. It was Emma. "Sarah?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but distant. I've been thinking, I don't want to lose you. Sarah paused. Her heart raced, but she stayed calm. I need time, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I need to figure things out. She hung up, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of the decision. She had spoken her truth. For the first time in days, she felt a small weight lift. The call left Sarah feeling uncertain. She paced the apartment, trying to push the thoughts of Emma away. The silence was deafening. She glanced at the empty shelf where Max's memorial had once stood. It hurt, but it also felt like a necessary goodbye. She had to accept that she couldn't go back. She poured herself some water and sat down on the couch. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Healing didn't come with an instruction manual, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. That night, Sarah sat in her new apartment, the bare walls no longer feeling cold. She had started to make the space her own. The city outside hummed with life, but inside, Sarah felt at peace. She wasn't waiting for Emma's apology. She had already made the hardest choice. Sarah smiled faintly as she looked out the window. The future was uncertain, but she felt ready to face it. The healing had begun, one small step at a time. Sarah woke up to the soft light of the morning filtering through the window. It was a new day, yet her mind still felt heavy with the unresolved tension. The phone sat silently on her nightstand, a reminder of the things left unsaid. Emma's apology hung in the air, but Sarah wasn't ready to let it define her anymore. She had spent enough time tangled in the past. The silence in the apartment was both comforting and isolating. She knew that she had to confront everything, not just Emma, but herself too. The process of healing wasn't linear. It wasn't as simple as locking the door and walking away. Sarah had to accept that the pain would linger, but that didn't mean it would control her. She rose from the bed, determined to face the day. It was time to stop looking back and start moving forward, even if she wasn't entirely sure what that looked like yet. Sarah spent the day out, walking through the park, letting the cool breeze clear her thoughts. The world around her was alive, people laughing, dogs running, children playing. It felt like she was slowly rejoining life piece by piece. Still, her thoughts kept drifting back to Emma. She hadn't seen her in weeks, but it was clear that Emma wasn't going to let things end without one final attempt. Sarah wondered if she was ready for that. She couldn't ignore the past, but she didn't want it to dictate her future either. What was forgiveness, really? Was it about letting someone back in, or about letting go of the anger? Sarah wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it. She sat on a park bench, taking in the quiet, reflecting on everything that had led her here. It was a lot to process, but for the first time she didn't feel so alone. The phone buzzed again, as Sarah was leaving the park. She picked it up without thinking. It was Emma. "Can we meet?" the message read. Sarah's heart skipped. She had been expecting this. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt conflicted. She couldn't avoid Emma forever, but meeting her meant facing everything she had left behind. Sarah had found her own space, her own peace, but could she still face the one person who had shattered it all? She stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. "Maybe," she typed back, not quite ready to say yes, but not quite ready to say no either. The weight of the decision hung in the balance. Sarah met Emma at a small cafe later that week. She arrived early, finding a quiet corner to sit. The familiar tension was in the air, thick and unspoken. Emma walked in, her eyes searching the room before settling on Sarah. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Emma walked over, her face strained with uncertainty. "I've been thinking about you a lot," Emma said, sitting down across from her. "About everything." Sarah nodded, unsure of what to say. There were so many things they needed to talk about, but the words felt heavy, stuck somewhere deep inside her. Emma's presence brought a rush of old emotions, ones Sarah had worked so hard to keep at bay. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say," Emma continued, her voice quieter. "But I'm sorry, I really am." Sarah took a deep breath, holding the words she wanted to say tightly in her chest. The silence between them felt thick, but Sarah wasn't ready to let go of her own peace just yet. The conversation with Emma was difficult, but Sarah didn't let it break her. She listened, she acknowledged the past, but she didn't allow herself to get lost in it again. By the end of the meeting, she was calm. "I appreciate your apology," Sarah said softly. "But I've already made peace with this. I've moved on and I'm not going back." Emma looked down, her face a mix of relief and sadness. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stood up to leave, the weight of the conversation settling around her like a cloud that had finally passed. She had faced her past, and now it was time to let go. As Sarah walked out of the cafe, she felt lighter. She wasn't ready for a fresh start with Emma, but she was ready for the next chapter of her life. Sarah woke up to the soft hum of the city outside her window. The morning light spilled across the floor, bathing the room in a warm glow. It had been a long time since she had felt this settled. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, decisions, and hard truths. But now, sitting in the quiet of her apartment, Sarah finally felt like she had reached a place of peace. The phone had stopped buzzing with messages from Emma, and the weight of her decisions no longer felt heavy. The apartment, once a place of uncertainty, now felt like home. But even in the calm, Sarah knew that change was a constant. She couldn't predict what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came her way. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that was enough. Later that day, Sarah went for a walk to the park. The trees had started to bloom, and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of new beginnings. As she walked along the path, she thought about how far she had come. There had been days when she didn't know if she would make it through, when the pain of the past felt like it would swallow her whole. But now, as she stood in the middle of the park, surrounded by life, she realized just how much strength she had gained. The space between her and Emma had widened, but it had also allowed Sarah to find herself again. She was no longer defined by what had happened. She had her own story now. A story that was still unfolding, but one that she could finally control. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand. Her thoughts drifted to Emma, to the past, but they no longer carried the weight they once had. She had come to terms with everything that had happened. Forgiveness was something Sarah had given herself, not Emma. She had been afraid to let go, afraid of what it might mean for her to move on. But now, she understood that moving on wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting that some things were out of her control and focusing on what she could change. The journey had been long and painful, but it had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who could face the future with clarity and purpose. She wasn't waiting for closure anymore, she had created it for herself. Sarah sat at her window that night, watching the stars flicker in the sky. The city below was alive with energy, but up here, it was peaceful. She thought about everything she had been through, the heartbreak, the confusion, the anger, and she realized that it had all led her to this moment. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, finding strength where she had once only seen weakness. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Sarah took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the cool night air wash over her. She wasn't afraid of what came next. She knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but she was ready. She had fought for her peace, and now it was hers to keep. As Sarah walked out the door the next morning, she left behind a note for herself. "I won't wait anymore," it read. It was simple, but it was everything. She wasn't waiting for things to get better. She was making them better. Sarah had taken control of her life, not by waiting for things to change, but by changing them herself. She had found her voice again, and it was louder than any of the fears she had once carried. As she stepped into the world outside, she felt lighter, freer, and more alive than she ever had before. There was no more looking back, only moving forward, one step at a time.